For decades, the world has operated on a single, seemingly unbreakable economic assumption. China is the undisputed, unstoppable factory of the world, fueled by an endless supply of cheap, willing labor and governed by a social contract that guaranteed economic prosperity in exchange for absolute political compliance. But today, that foundational pillar of the global economy is crumbling before our very eyes, and the deafening roar of Chinese manufacturing is rapidly being replaced by the sound of shattered glass, shuttered factory doors, and the furious chants of millions of betrayed workers taking to the streets. We are witnessing a monumental and unprecedented collapse in support for the traditional Chinese economic model, a phenomenon that is tearing at the very fabric of the nation as workers literally flee the factories that once built the modern Chinese miracle. The grand illusion of infinite growth is evaporating, leaving behind a stark reality of unpaid wages, brutal layoffs, massive youth unemployment, and a deeply disillusioned generation that is outright rejecting the grueling, exploitative labor conditions their parents silently endured. This is no longer just a story about slowing gross domestic product or minor supply chain reallocations. It is a profound societal reckoning, a massive structural breakdown where the working class, the very backbone of China's meteoric rise, is walking away, sparking a wave of unprecedented labor unrest and factory closures that threaten to destabilize the global economic order. To truly grasp the magnitude of this collapse, we must look at the data reports tracking dissent in the Chinese industrial heartland. According to tracking data from Freedom House's China Dissent Monitor, labor dissent has surged to become the single largest driver of public protest across the country, with over 5,000 dissent events documented annually as economic distress deepens. In the fourth quarter of 2025 alone, workers led over 54% of all recorded public protest events, primarily over unpaid wages, sudden plant closures, and missing benefits. Across the country, from Hunan Province's Dao County in central China to Sichuan's Suining City in the southwest and Inner Mongolia's Tongliao City in the northeast, hundreds of disgruntled workers have taken to the streets. The catalyst for much of this devastation has been the crushing weight of external trade pressures, specifically the staggering impact of steep United States tariffs on Chinese imports enacted amid a broader global economic downturn. Financial modeling from international trade analysts estimates that up to 16 million export-dependent jobs across manufacturing hubs in Guangdong, Zhejiang, and Jiangsu are at severe risk due to aggressive trade barriers and tariff hikes reaching as high as 145% on certain Chinese goods. When export orders dry up, factories do not gracefully wind down operations. They abruptly shutter their doors overnight, locking out the workers who depend on them for survival. The personal human stories emerging from these sudden closures reveal a desperate, volatile environment. In Suining City, for instance, workers gathered outside an electronics manufacturer that produces flexible circuit boards, shouting for strikes after management abruptly stopped paying wages at the start of the year, while secretly withholding mandatory Social Security contributions since June 2023. Similarly, in Dao County, hundreds of employees from a sports goods manufacturer organized a massive strike after the factory shut down without providing owed compensation, allegedly having wrongfully terminated over 100 female employees over the age of 50, citing mandatory retirement thresholds, all while withholding months of earned wages. The situation has grown so dire that labor unrest is now considered a primary driver of civil disobedience in the country, with reports indicating that workers make up over 40% of all in-person and online dissent events in China. Whispers and local economic theories have even begun circulating among domestic labor networks, alleging that corrupt local officials and factory bosses are intentionally bankrupting operations to siphon off provincial development subsidies before fleeing abroad. A growing conspiracy theory fueled by the sheer volume of owners vanishing overnight. When migrant workers, who historically traveled thousands of miles from rural villages to coastal megacities with dreams of upward mobility, are left stranded without pay, the foundational trust between the state, the employer, and the citizen completely evaporates. The contagion of collapse is spreading through virtually every low-margin, high-volume sector that once defined Chinese dominance, leaving ghost towns in its wake. Take the toy manufacturing industry, for example, which was once a key pillar of China's export manufacturing base. Today, it is facing one of its most severe downturns in decades, battered by weakening global demand, elevated logistics costs, rising raw material prices, and ongoing supply chain disruptions. Container freight rates on major trade routes have fluctuated wildly, squeezing the margins of manufacturers who operate on pennies per unit. In key industrial clusters like Yulin in Guangxi province, multiple toy production units shut down on the exact same day, triggering sudden and catastrophic job losses for thousands of workers. These instantaneous mass layoffs inevitably lead to furious worker protests over unpaid wages and pending dues, forcing local authorities to deploy security personnel just to manage the escalating tensions in these affected industrial zones. Even in higher tech sectors, the unrest is palpable. In Dalian, Liaoning province, around 600 workers at an electronics plant formerly operated by a Japanese semiconductor firm launched a massive strike and protest march, terrified that their years of accumulated service, severance guarantees, and benefits would be erased as the factory was transferred to a new domestic parent company. What makes this industrial exodus so unique is that it is not just a reaction to factory closures. It is a fundamental, generational rejection of the factory lifestyle itself. Young Chinese citizens are looking at the grueling reality of manufacturing work and emphatically saying no. The traditional model relied on millions of young, desperate workers willing to endure the infamous 996 work culture, working from 9 in the morning to 9 at night, 6 days a week, just to scrape by. But the current generation, highly educated and deeply connected to the internet, refuses to be treated as disposable cogs in a relentless industrial machine. They are acutely aware of the rampant worker abuse in Chinese factory and trades jobs, which frequently involves forced unpaid overtime, wage garnishing, a total lack of basic protective gear, and the terrifying reality of not being paid salaries for months on end. They have seen their parents break their bodies on assembly lines, only to be discarded without pensions or severance when the factory goes bankrupt. In electric vehicle manufacturing plants in Zhejiang province, for example, workers recently halted production to protest excessive working hours, claiming they were forced to work up to 13 hours a day while receiving paltry take-home pay that was then heavily slashed by arbitrary wage deductions. Faced with these brutal conditions, it is entirely logical that the youth are fleeing. This mass rejection of blue-collar labor has created a paradoxical and devastating economic crisis. Severe youth unemployment occurring simultaneously with desperate factory labor shortages. China's urban youth unemployment rate for people aged 16 to 24, excluding students, has been a source of intense domestic anxiety. Even as official figures fluctuate around 14.9%, independent economists from Peking University and international financial institutions estimate that real youth joblessness, when accounting for underemployed youth and those who have completely stopped searching for work, ranges between 30 and 40%. Millions of college graduates enter the workforce every year with degrees in STEM, business, and humanities, only to find that the white-collar jobs they were promised do not exist in a slowing economy. Yet, despite this massive pool of unemployed youth, factories cannot find enough people to man their assembly lines. The truth is that Chinese parents would rather their children be unemployed after attending university than see them endure the indignity and physical toll of shift work at a dirty, dangerous factory. Manual labor and trades are heavily stigmatized, and modern Chinese youth would much rather take their chances navigating the gig economy as food delivery drivers or rideshare operators than subject themselves to the authoritarian, abusive environment of a traditional sweatshop. The psychological response to this unwinnable economic game has given birth to massive countercultural movements that strike fear into the hearts of policymakers in Beijing. The youth have embraced philosophies like Tang Ping, lying flat, and Bai Lan, let it rot. These are not just internet memes. They are silent, passive-aggressive protests against a system that demands everything and gives nothing in return. Adding to the tension are persistent online conspiracy theories circulating on underground forums like Tieba and Telegram channels. One popular theory suggests that factory automation and AI are being deliberately accelerated by state-backed oligarchs, not for economic efficiency, but to permanently eliminate the politically volatile blue-collar working class altogether. Another widely shared narrative alleges that official economic data, including youth employment figures, is being systematically scrubbed by local cadres to hide a far larger structural depression. When a young person realizes that, no matter how hard they work, they will never be able to afford a home in a Tier 1 city, never be able to afford to raise a child, and never escape the crushing cycle of debt and exploitation, they simply opt out. They refuse to consume, refuse to marry, refuse to take out mortgages, and most importantly, refuse to break their backs in factories to enrich a tiny elite. The psychological support for the state's economic vision has collapsed, replaced by a pervasive sense of nihilism and exhaustion that is draining the vitality from the nation's workforce. Complicating this mass exodus from the factories is the catastrophic collapse of the Chinese real estate sector, which is deeply intertwined with the fate of working class. For decades, the property market was the ultimate engine of Chinese wealth creation, driving demand for steel, cement, glass, and countless manufactured goods. Millions of migrant workers found employment not just in export factories, but on the massive construction sites of Evergrande, Country Garden, and other heavily leveraged developers. But as the property bubble burst, leaving behind thousands of unfinished, rotting apartment complexes across the country, those construction jobs vanished overnight. Freedom House reports show that protests linked to the failing property sector and unpaid construction workers account for nearly 44% of all dissent cases recorded in recent years. This created a dual crisis. Migrant workers were left unpaid for their labor on stalled housing projects, while simultaneously watching their life savings evaporate if they had pre-purchased one of these unfinished homes. In Shaanxi province, migrant workers recently protested because they had not received their wages for construction projects in months, a scene repeating itself in every province. With the domestic real estate engine broken and the international export engine sputtering under the weight of tariffs and shifting supply chains, the Chinese worker has nowhere left to turn. Furthermore, the structural shift in global supply chains is accelerating this domestic crisis, creating a feedback loop of decline. Multinational corporations, spooked by geopolitical tensions, trade wars, unpredictable lockdowns of the past, and the rising cost of Chinese labor, are rapidly executing their China Plus One strategies. They are packing up and relocating their manufacturing hubs to Vietnam, India, Mexico, and Southeast Asia. As these foreign entities pull their capital and operations out of China, they take millions of jobs with them. When a major foreign-owned electronics plant relocates, it doesn't just hurt the workers directly employed there, it devastates the entire local ecosystem of suppliers, food vendors, logistics companies, and municipal governments that relied on that factory's tax revenue. Local governments in China are already drowning in hidden debt, estimated by global IMF reports to exceed $10 trillion in local government financing vehicle, LGFV, debt, from years of massive infrastructure spending and reliance on land sales. With the property market dead and factories fleeing, these local municipalities are broke. They can no longer afford to bail out failing companies, subsidize wages, or suppress protests with financial payouts. The financial buffer that once kept the peace has disappeared, leaving raw, unmitigated economic conflict in its wake. The narrative pushed by state media is that China is gracefully transitioning into high-quality, high-tech manufacturing, dominating the global market in electric vehicles, solar panels, and lithium-ion batteries. While it is true that China leads in these advanced sectors, this technological leap does not solve the massive unemployment crisis at the bottom of the economic pyramid. Advanced manufacturing is highly automated. It requires robotics engineers, software developers, and highly skilled technicians, not millions of low-skilled migrant workers or newly graduated students with generic degrees. A single automated gigafactory might produce more output than 10 traditional factories, but it employs a fraction of the people. This means that while the headline export numbers for green technology might look strong, the actual wealth distribution and job creation for the average citizen are severely constrained. The millions of garment workers, toy assemblers, and basic electronics manufacturers who are losing their jobs to tariffs and factory closures cannot simply transition to programming robotic arms in an electric vehicle plant. They are left entirely behind, structural casualties of an economy that is trying to sprint into the future while its foundation crumbles. As we look to the horizon, the implications of this collapsing support and factory exodus are monumental for the entire globe. For decades, the world imported deflation from China. Cheap Chinese labor kept the cost of consumer goods, electronics, and clothing artificially low, allowing Western consumers to enjoy an incredibly high standard of living. But as Chinese workers demand higher wages, refuse to work in sweatshops, and as factories shut down due to protests and tariffs, the era of cheap Chinese goods is officially over. This means higher prices at the checkout counter for consumers in the United States, Europe, and beyond. But more importantly, it marks a dangerous inflection point for the Chinese political system. The implicit bargain of the last 40 years was simple. The citizens surrendered their political freedoms, and in return, the state provided continuous, year-over-year economic enrichment. With that promise now broken, with wages unpaid, factories closed, and the youth actively rebelling against the system through apathy and localized strikes, the ruling party faces an existential crisis of legitimacy. The workers are fleeing the factories, the youth are lying flat, and the great economic engine of the 21st century is violently stalling. The ripple effects of this collapse will not be contained within China's borders. They will reshape global trade, security, and prosperity for decades to come, proving once and for all that no economic miracle can last forever when built on the backs of a broken and disillusioned working class.